It is the ideal bioweapon, which is caused by Bacillus anthracis, which is a type of bacteria that is typically discovered in soil all over the world. The disease in question is anthrax. It is what gives rise to nightmares. Spores are able to persist in adverse conditions for millennia at a time, and they are capable of infecting anyone that comes into contact with them, consumes them, or breathes in even a minute amount of them. Over 90% of people can die as a result of it. However, the simplicity with which anthrax may be distributed is what makes it such a powerful weapon, not the fact that it is so difficult to obtain. Once perfected, it can be delivered to victims, used to infect their food or water, or even sprayed from an airplane flying overhead. All of these methods are viable options. Experts believe that a mere 100 kilograms of aerosolized anthrax would be sufficient to kill 3 million people and render huge cities uninhabitable for a number of generations. These kinds of assaults are, thankfully, extremely uncommon. A single bioterrorist has been successful in causing a large number of victims with anthrax up until this point. In the year 2001, 5 Americans were killed when spore-filled letters were used, but it does not mean that there have not been a great deal of near misses throughout the course of the decades. Anthrax weapons have been experimented with by a wide variety of groups, including the Nazis, the British, and Japanese doomsday cults. In some instances, these researchers have even come close to making them a horrific reality. Smallpox, Ebola, and the plague are all examples of microscopic killers that occur in nature. However, Bacillus anthracis, a rod-shaped bacteria that comes in 3 different strains, is possibly the most terrifying of all of these infections. All around the world, from the Americas to Africa to Eurasia, anthracis can be found in the soil naturally. In certain respects, it is relatively harmless, and it only slightly affects human beings. It is not contagious, which means that it cannot be transmitted from one person to another in the same way that, for example, coronaviruses may. On the other hand, this is merely one of the many positive aspects of the potentially lethal Bacillus anthracis. In spite of the fact that it could not be able to traverse the entire Earth, it possesses other talons that are significantly more terrifying. It is possible that its capacity to create spores is the most worrying of them. After they have been produced, these spores have the potential to remain latent in the soil or in animals for decades or even centuries. In the United Kingdom, for instance, living spores were recently found in an unearthed hospital that dates back to the Middle Ages. In spite of this, these spores are only found in natural environments, and once they enter a body through inhalation or contact, they remain dormant. In a very short amount of time, all bets are off. Within the walls of the house, new germs are proliferating, which is causing the spread of poisons at a horrifying rate. Anthrax is the name given to the sickness that these toxins induce, and it is one of the most lethal diseases that have ever been discovered by humans. The fact that there are 3 distinct ways to become infected with anthrax is quite fascinating. There is not a single one of them that is not a riot of laughter, yet there are some that cannot be compared to others. When those spores enter your body by a cart or an insect bite, they cause dense black lesions on your skin. This is the most prevalent form of cutaneous anthrax, and mercifully, it is also the mildest form. Anthrax is derived from the Greek word for coal, which is coal even if you disregard all of the medical advice and just let it do its job. There is still only a 20% risk that it will kill you. This is, however, a pretty gross condition that can be readily treated. Anthrax of the gastrointestinal tract, which is extremely uncommon, is the next most lethal kind. Consuming meat that is infected with the disease can result in the death of up to 60% of those who contract it. But because the majority of farmers are astute enough to avoid packaging and selling the meat of an animal that has recently passed away due to an extremely strange illness, nearly no one is affected by this particular form of the disease in today's world. We are now only left with the 3rd and last form of anthrax, which is acquired through inhalation. This is the point at which nature ramps up the level of horror to 11. After being exposed to the virus, you will begin to suffer chills and a low temperature anywhere from 1 week to 2 months later. In a normal situation, this fever will go away after only a few days, but this is only a fake recovery. In a short period of time, your temperature will skyrocket and you will have intense discomfort in your chest, which will be followed by vomiting. Blood expelling fits are a fit. You will experience a poisonous shock in your body. It is possible that the entire process from the beginning to the end can be completed in just 48 hours, untreated, and in the majority of cases, hospitals won't even realize you have it until an autopsy is performed on you. The survival rate for patients who have inhaled anthrax is less than 15%. What is the unfortunate news? It is precisely this kind of organism that is most likely to be employed as a bioweapon. With that being said, it is important to emphasize that anthrax infections are currently uncommon in the majority of the world. Less than 1 case is reported annually in the United States, which is a relatively low number. Nobody in the United States had been diagnosed with inhalation anthrax since 1976, and that was before the year 2000. There could be as low as 20,000 instances reported annually around the world. Although this is not a horrible number coming from a population of over 8 billion people, it does not mean that the history of anthrax throughout human history has always been so peaceful. Bacillus anthracis has been responsible for an unfathomable number of deaths and destructions over the course of several centuries. There is a lack of clarity on the precise origins of anthrax, as well as the time when it was first documented in historical documents. There are ancient Chinese scriptures that include the first known description of the sickness, but some throw the finger at the Old Testament as the source of the information. According to the book of Exodus, the 5th plague that struck Egypt was a strange disease that eradicated cattle in a short amount of time. This is then followed by the 6th plague, which is characterized by the appearance of boils on the skin of humans. Some contemporary readers may find this to be reminiscent of ancient Egyptians contracting cutaneous anthrax as a result of handling their dead and lifeless animals. However, we are still unable to determine when anthrax first arose. It is also unknown where the event took place. In addition, there is a significant amount of genetic variation among the bacteria that are found in both southern Africa and Eurasia, which further suggests that the bacteria originated in either of these regions. The fact that it is located someplace in either Africa, Europe, or Asia does not exactly condense the situation. At the same time, we are not entirely certain how we were able to travel from its birthplace to the soil of each and every continent. But it is reasonable to assume that human beings were engaged. Although it was a long time ago, the discovery of an animal that had passed away due to an ailment that was not recognized was less of a reason to panic out and more of a reason to be like wave-free stuff during that time. There would have been spores present in clothing that was manufactured from animals that had been killed by anthrax. There are spores. Because of this, our ancestors dispersed themselves as they traveled. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, anthrax was one of the few non-native diseases that was already present in the region. This is one piece of evidence that supports this particular hypothesis. The results of genetic research indicate that the bacteria most likely arrived in Alaska approximately 15,000 years ago before propagating southward. What you would anticipate seeing if it went alongside the first humans is exactly what you would notice. Another piece of evidence comes in the form of genetic data, which reveals that among the 3 different types of bacteria, one of them went insane about the year 3000 BC. The year 3000 BC. It just so happens to coincide with the beginning of the Bronze Age, which was a time when Europeans were just beginning to become quite interested in the concept of long-distance trade. Owing to the fact that livestock farming already puts individuals in contact with animals that are potentially carrying anthrax, it appears to be plausible. These same individuals then disseminated the spores throughout old trade routes, which resulted in the beginning of several millennia of humans being infected with anthracis, which resulted in the death of any humans who were unfortunate enough to become infected with us in the ancient world. In his work, the Roman poet Virgil depicted a disease that was transmitted from animals to humans. This plague was characterized by high fevers and the appearance of sores on the skin of those who came into contact with the fur of animals. Due to the fact that anthrax was so widespread throughout Europe throughout the Middle Ages, it was given the epithet Black Bane. In fact, there is a notion that the strange sweating ailment that affected England throughout the latter half of the 15th century and the early 16th century may have been nothing more than anthrax. There is no doubt that the symptoms include nausea, vomiting, high fever, severe pain, and death within 48 hours. The sweating disease was so dangerous that it frightened chroniclers from writing about it. People who had grown up hearing stories about the Black Death, which had just occurred at the time. On the other hand, so much for anthrax. It's terrifying, and it's somewhat dangerous as well. During the year 1770, for instance, there was a possible outbreak in San Domingo. Currently, it is believed that Haiti has killed 15,000 people in just 6 weeks. However, this would also turn out to be one of the last major deaths caused by the disease by the time the 19th century rolled around. At long last, humanity was starting to put up a fight. In the year 1850, the first significant breakthrough about anthrax occurred. Casimir de Vane, a French physician, distinguished the rod-shaped bacterium that came to be known as Bacillus anthracis with his discovery. On the other hand, one could argue that the journey that humanity took to obtain an understanding of the sickness actually started 7 years earlier, on December 11, 1843. Robert Koch was born in northwestern Germany at that time. He was the third of an astonishing 13 children who had the potential to become a significant figure in the field of early microbiology. In addition, it was his work on anthrax that would ultimately bring him the most fame. In the early 1870s, Koch completed his service as a physician in the army during the Franco-Prussian War. He then moved to Stein, where he is still living now. Stein was in the midst of a fatal plague when Koch arrived in Poland, which was a lucky move for science because it occurred at the same time that Stein was in Poland. Anthrax was responsible for the deaths of 56,000 animals and 528 people in this small town, which had only been around for 4 years. As a result of the severity of the problem, entire meadows were deemed off limits since the soil in those pastures was guaranteed to kill everything that was grazing on them. On the contrary, this was precisely the kind of medical issue that Koch was preoccupied with. Experiments were carried out by him, and he examined the blood of deceased animals as well as the soils that had provided them with the infection. Anthrax was firmly linked to Bacillus anthracis, which was the organism that discovered its spores and later identified its nearly indestructible properties. This was referred to as the cryou. This was the first time in human history that a particular sickness was shown to be caused by a single species of bacteria. As a result, he was able to offer additional recommendations, like as the practice of burning the bodies of animals that had been infected with the disease. In addition, discoveries are not exclusive to Germany. Over in northern Britain, there had been a steady increase in the level of anxiety around wool, which was the kind of ailment that was first documented in the year 1838. Only individuals who dealt with wool were afflicted by it, and it caused black sores to appear on their hands. Local physicians known as Edison and Bell were consulted for lesions that occasionally progressed to a type of pneumonia that was fatal. Obviously, there are discoveries. The researchers came to the conclusion that the disease that affected wool sorters had to be anthrax, despite the fact that proving it was a brutal process that involved injecting blood from a man who had died from the illness and from healthy animals. Because of this work, industrial health rules in Britain were reformatted. On the other hand, by that time, another scientist who had already built on Koch's was working to carry the fight against anthrax in humans to the next level. Louis Pasteur, the man who invented the process of pasteurization, had already achieved widespread fame by the early 1880s. Just in his home country of France, his work was responsible for saving the lives of tens of thousands of people each year. On the other hand, the shop was also experiencing an anthrax epidemic at the time. Numerous people and an uncountable number of animals were passing away as a result of the sickness. There was only one thing that sprang to Pasteur's mind when he heard the word breakthrough, and that was to demonstrate to that German dummy what true genius looked like. In the spring of 1881, after collecting funding from farmers who were desperate to put an end to the plague, Pasteur conducted public experiments of his new anthrax vaccine. These experiments were unsuccessful, and crowds gathered to watch him inoculate 24 sheep, 6 girls, and 1 goat. Meanwhile, a control group of the same size was left unvaccinated nearby. After injecting all of the animals with anthrax bacteria on the 31st of May, Pasteur instructed the crowd to come back 2 days later. When they did, they discovered that every single member of the control group had either passed away or was in the process of passing away. During this time, not a single animal that had been vaccinated had passed away. Agricultural practices were fundamentally altered as a result of this enormous breakthrough. However, it is not safe for use in human beings. Anthrax outbreaks among animals were significantly reduced as a result of Pasteur's vaccine. When combined with Max Stern's far safer vaccine that was developed in the 1930s, it appeared all too soon that anthrax may be relegated to the annals of recorded history. Nevertheless, at the same time that the war against anthrax in animals was picking up steam, the scientists working for the military around the world were coming to a frightening realization. Is it possible that there is more to anthrax than just the fact that it is a scourge? In the event that they were able to transform these bacteria refiners into a weapon, what would happen? Considering that it was a war in which countries who were meant to be civilized were hurling mustard gas at one another, it is a miracle that anthrax did not play a role in World War I. Because of this, the world is now aware of the etiology of the sickness, was aware of the hardy spores that may infect people even after a number of years had passed on. However, the only documented instance of anthrax being used during World War I was when German saboteurs infected horses that were being sold to the Allies from territories that were neutral. Despite the fact that this had little impact on the war, other than to irritate people who care about animals, the Geneva Protocol of 1925 continued to prohibit the use of biological weapons. It is remarkable that the majority of the signatories would adhere to this practice over the course of the next few decades, although not all of them would. Somewhere in the Far East, new powers are emerging that have the potential to transform anthrax into a lethal weapon. It was in the year 1932 that Imperial Japan began conducting experiments on human beings in Manchuria, which was then under Japanese occupation. Prisoners were subjected to anthrax, along with a wide variety of other dreadful infections, and their survival rates were tracked to determine how long they could withstand the disease. In addition to this, by the year 1937, Tokyo had amassed a formidable collection of biological weapons. It was all too eager to employ its weapons on the civilian population of China from the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War until it was finally used. Anthrax was given a minor but horrific role at the first time that Commander Shirashi was in charge of the situation. Before performing vivisections on civilian captives without administering anesthesia, Japan's Unit 731 initially infected them with the bacterium. A number of diseases were also present, including the plague that Imperial Japan sprayed directly over Chinese cities. Anthrax was one of the plagues. It is believed that she was responsible for the deaths of around 300,000 citizens as a result of her bioterror campaign. This is due to the fact that the concept of karma is laughable in reality, as she concluded the war without being executed and Mussolini began to receive immunity from the United States. Washington, you deserve congratulations. During World War II, Japan's anthrax program was not the only one that existed. Rather, it was notable for its scale and the savagery with which it was carried out. The British, who were located more than 9,000 kilometers away, were likewise attempting to figure out how to use the plague to their advantage against their adversaries. It was in 1936 when spies reported that Germany was investing in germ warfare that London's bioweapons program got its start. When World War II broke out, the Army Research Lab in Porton Down started conducting experiments on a wide variety of diseases, ranging from foot and mouth disease to Rheinpest. The goal was to create a weapon that would kill a large number of cattle in Nazi Germany, with the expectation that this would cause widespread fear and starvation. With regard to which ailment did this prove to be the most effective treatment? During the summer of 1942, the government of Scotland gained control of the Scottish islands of Dunat, which were formerly uninhabited. After the sheep were tethered in open enclosures, anthrax spores were dropped from a low-flying plane with the intention of infecting them. One would be grossly underestimating the level of accomplishment achieved by the exam if they were to label it a success. All of the sheep were killed by the anthrax spores within a span of 3 days. In addition, they left the islands utterly uninhabitable, which is a regrettable consequence. Even after the war was over, the island continued to be off-limits to anyone. Because of the high level of contamination in the soil, even animals that are native to the Chernobyl exclusion zone would be advised to avoid traveling there. It wasn't until the middle of the 1980s that grid art could be decontaminated, and that was only after the government of the United Kingdom removed the topsoil and chemically treated whatever was left with formaldehyde. As a result of occurrences such as this one, it became abundantly evident that the idea of hoarding literal tons of anthrax was a rather awful one. By the middle of the 20th century, it was believed that a mere 100 kg would be sufficient to wipe out 3 million people and make huge cities uninhabitable for years to come. It is very clear that humankind could not continue in this manner, not if it desired to carry on into the following century. At long last, it was time to put an end to the use of bioweapons for good and for all time. Not everyone was willing to go along with the plan, which was the only obstacle encountered. Extremely small things have the potential to give rise to catastrophic tragedies. Just have a peek. Chernobyl, which was caused by an unneeded safety test, led to the destruction of the Challenger, which was caused by a simple seal that did not work in the cold. It would soon be determined that a single damaged air filter was the root cause of all of the suffering that the residents of Sverdlovsk, which is now known as Yekaterinburg, experienced. By this time, it was April of 1979. 7 years ago, the Soviet Union joined the United States of America and 100 other countries in signing the Biological Weapons Convention. This convention was meant to prevent the development of weapons and the stockpiling of a wide variety of infectious diseases, including anthrax, smallpox, and others. As far as we know, the convention put an end to the age of bioweapons. It would appear that the Soviet signatory had been keeping their fingers crossed, which is unfortunate for Sverdlovsk. During the spring of 1979, the city was hit by an outbreak of anthrax. It is known that anywhere from 68 to 105 persons ultimately passed away as a result of the disease, despite the fact that accurate data are impossible to get. During that time period, the Soviet authorities declared that all of the individuals who had been killed and consumed meat that had been purchased illegally were infected. It wasn't until 1992, following the fall of communism, that academics from outside the country were granted permission to investigate by placing each of the victims on a map. In a short amount of time, they made the discovery that the sickness had spread throughout the city in a fairly straight route, a line that led directly back to the malfunctioning air filter at a neighboring bioweapons laboratory. The tragic spill that occurred at Red Lobster served as a sobering reminder of how lethal anthrax may be. On the other hand, it was also a stroke of incredible luck. If the wind had been blowing in the opposite way, the spores would have been transported directly into the central business district of the city, where they may have caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The Soviet Union, however, was not the only country that continued to experiment with biological fire. In the 1990s, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of South Africa would present a report stating that the apartheid administration had accumulated anthrax spores and used them for at least one assassination. In addition, it has been hypothesized that the government of Rhodesia, which is comprised of white minority people, also utilized the disease during the Bush War, despite the fact that all documents have been destroyed. Nevertheless, in spite of these occurrences, the 70s and 80s witnessed a gradual decrease in the number of countries engaged in the cultivation of anthrax for their military forces. Instead, nature's perfect bioweapon came to the notice of even more terrifying entities: terrorists. It is possible that Dark Harvest, a group that is still shrouded in mystery, was the first non-state entity to experiment with anthrax. They were successful in removing 2 barrels of soil that was contaminated with spores from the Grenada Islands in Scotland. The initial barrel was abandoned in the vicinity of Porton Down. Despite the fact that at least one of the barrels was proven to be tainted with spores, the second barrel was discarded beyond the boundaries of the Conservative Party conference that was held that year. Neither of the attacks had someone in second place. To be honest, it might not even be accurate to refer to them as attacks. According to the rumors that Dark Harvest were actually simply a group of Scottish locals who were fed up with living so near to a dangerous island off of the United Kingdom government decontaminated grenades, the group was never heard from again. Therefore, it is reasonable to assert that the flirting with anthrax that terrorists have been engaging in has not gotten off to a good start. Over the course of the subsequent 10 years, this unfortunate condition of affairs would not continue. 2 persons who were quite different from one another and very frightening were going to endeavor to surpass whatever the Dark Harvest had achieved. It was unfortunate that one of them was going to be successful. The majority of the 20th of 1995 was a pleasant day in Tokyo, a morning in the springtime that is so bright and sunny that it makes you feel grateful to be alive. At the height of rush hour, however, a quite different scenario was taking place deep below the city, in the darkness of the subway system of the city. All at the same time, members of the Aum Shinrikyo Doomsday Cult had punctured bags of sarin that were being transported on different trains. 13 individuals were killed and 6,000 more were sickened as a result of the cloud of nerve gas that was produced. In spite of the fact that it is still considered the most devastating terrorist attack in Japanese history, the fact that sarin was used as a backup option was not found until the authorities conducted a raid on the headquarters of the cult. An anthrax attack was supposed to be carried out with the intention of rendering Tokyo inoperable. In an attempt to recruit members among Japan's elite, one of the wealthiest cults in history targeted individuals who had knowledge of weapons of mass destruction. 2 of its members had previous experience working in the field of microbiology, and they were able to obtain a limited quantity of anthrax spores. The aerosolized version of the spores that the cult cultured in 1993 in the form of enormous bats with a foul odor had been sprayed all over Tokyo with the hope that it would kill thousands of people. Fortunately, even the microbiologists working for the cult were not experts in anthrax. It was impossible for the strain they utilized to cause harm to human beings. The reason that Aum decided to produce its own nerve gas was because of the failure that it had experienced. It is not possible to say the same thing about their American equivalent, despite the fact that the preparations for anthrax would be a dreadful failure. The month of October in the year 2001 was the first indication that the United States of America was being attacked by bioweapons. It had been just 3 weeks since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and during those 3 weeks, the nation had hardly had time to mourn, let alone get ready for another terrorist attack. Therefore, when picture editor Robert Stevens went into a hospital in Florida suffering from inhalation anthrax, everyone assumed that it was just a rare accident. Even when spores were discovered at his place of employment, nobody in their right mind contemplated the possibility that they had been purposefully placed there. Following that, on October 12th, a letter that contained powdered anthrax was opened at NBC, which resulted in the poisoning of an employee. In the 2 days that followed, Congress was polluted by yet another letter. A significant one of the FBI's most significant concerns has been met. At this point, terrorists were in possession of anthrax that had been weaponized. The two anthrax attacks that occurred in 2001 continued until November 21st, when the second and final victim, a woman who was 94 years old, passed away in Connecticut. 220 persons were infected, and 5 of them passed away. The case, which has been given the codename Thorax, is still shrouded in a great deal of uncertainty today. The FBI and the Department of Justice consider it to have been closed in 2008. Dr. Bruce Ivans, an expert in anthrax, committed suicide at the very moment that they were about to arrest him. He was also struggling with anger issues and had violent thoughts at the time. Ivan was someone who exemplified the characteristics of a lone wolf terrorist. Despite this, he was never charged with anything, and further investigations revealed that the inquiry had some faults. Nevertheless, regardless of whether or not the assaults were led by Dr. Ivans, the aftermath of the attacks brought about a shift in Washington's perspective on anthrax. It was decided to send cleanup personnel from the United States to areas that were high in anthrax, one of which being the abandoned Soviet bioweapons lab of Ursk-7. There are millions of dollars that have been spent on the destruction of spores on the grounds that the groups that were inspired by the attacks in 2001 attempt to obtain their own anthrax. It would appear that no one ever did it. Since the year 2001, there have been no documented instances of anthrax being employed as a form of bioweapon. Despite the fact that phony letters continue to be a persistent problem. They were mailed in the United States of America and the United Kingdom in 2008 alone. Even if there have been no recent instances of successful anthrax assaults, this does not indicate that anthrax does not continue to be a significant vulnerability. During the summer of 2016, Siberia saw an exceptionally warm summer, which resulted in a layer of permafrost melting for the first time in 8 decades. Dormant spores that had been present in the frozen carcass of a reindeer that had passed away over a century earlier were revived by it. From this single dead body, an anthrax epidemic spread over the region, resulting in the deaths of an uncountable number of reindeer and the infection of 72 people. Tragically, a boy who was 112 years old passed away. Considering that a single body can wreak such devastation, just think about what hundreds or even thousands of bodies could accomplish. Take into consideration all of the millions of animals that have perished as a result of anthrax in polar climes over the course of the ages. There is a possibility that animals that were buried in the permafrost may still retain spores that are lethal. As the world continues to warm as a result of climate change, it is quite probable that we will observe further incidents similar to this one in Russia, Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia. All of a sudden, more cases of anthrax that had been dormant for a long time resurfaced, ready to spread and infect new victims. As a result, the narrative of humanity's fight against anthrax is not even close to being finished. There is no way to know what the future will bring, despite the fact that we have the upper hand. Because there is no doubt about it, this particular bacteria is one of the most perfect killing machines that has ever evolved a sickness that is capable of rendering huge cities uninhabitable. We may be making progress in our struggle against adversaries on a tiny scale, but there is still a significant distance to travel.